They watched her like silence had weight, like every step she took pressed against something inside them they didn't understand, and not a single man in that town knew why he couldn't look away. The sun hung low over the street, burning through dust that drifted slow between wooden buildings, and her figure moved through it like she didn't belong to the same world, boots steady, shoulders straight, eyes forward, never lowering, never asking for space that should have been hers already. The first thing anyone noticed was the necklace, a thin leather cord resting against her collarbone, holding a small turquoise stone that caught the light in a way that made it feel older than the town itself, older than the hands that built it. And the second thing they noticed was how she didn't react, not to the whispers, not to the shifting feet, not to the way conversations died one by one as she passed. Men leaned against posts, hats tipped just enough to stare without hiding it. Others froze mid-sip, glasses hovering inches from their lips, and somewhere a chair scraped too loudly against wood, the kind of sound that makes people aware of themselves. But no one corrected it. No one moved, because the moment held them still. A man near the general store door nudged his friend, muttering something low, the kind of tone meant to provoke a reaction. But she didn't give him one, didn't even turn her head, and that seemed to unsettle him more than any response could have. 20 feet away, under the narrow shade of a saloon porch, Caleb Whitmore sat with his back to the post, hat pulled low, hands resting loosely around a glass he hadn't lifted in minutes, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the street, beyond her, beyond all of it, like he'd chosen not to see what everyone else couldn't stop watching. The contrast didn't go unnoticed, not by the quieter ones, the ones who paid attention to what wasn't done instead of what was, because out here, the difference between looking and not looking could mean more than words ever said. She stepped onto the wooden planks of the walkway, the boards creaking under her weight, and for a brief second the sound broke the tension, but only enough to sharpen it, because now they could hear her, measure her distance, anticipate her passing, and the closer she came, the more the air seemed to tighten, like something inevitable was about to unfold. A man standing near the saloon entrance shifted his stance, just enough to place himself in her path without making it obvious, testing something. Maybe himself, maybe her, and when she reached him, she didn't stop, didn't hesitate, just adjusted her step by half an inch, enough to pass without contact, without permission, and that small decision carried more weight than if she had pushed him aside. His smirk faltered, not gone, just thinner, like it had lost its certainty. Caleb's glass touched the table then, a soft, deliberate sound that didn't match the noise of the street, quieter, but somehow heavier, and for the first time since she appeared, a few heads turned toward him instead, drawn by something they couldn't name. He still didn't look at her. Not when she passed within 10 feet. Not when the turquoise stone caught the last strip of sunlight between them. Not even when the entire town seemed to hold its breath waiting for him to do what every other man already had. He remained still, and in that stillness, something shifted, subtle but real, like the edge of a storm changing direction. She slowed for half a second, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to feel, and though her eyes stayed forward, there was the faintest change in her breathing, the kind that comes when danger doesn't follow the pattern you expect. Behind her, the whispers returned, quieter now, more uncertain, and ahead of her, the street stretched toward a small boarding house at the far end, its windows dark, its doors slightly open, waiting. The town watched her continue, watched her leave the center of their attention without releasing it. And as she stepped off the last board and back onto the dust, the sun dipped just enough to pull her into shadow, where outlines softened and details faded, except for one, the turquoise, still catching light where there shouldn't have been any, and somewhere behind her, Caleb finally lifted his head, just an inch, just enough to see where she was going, not who she was, and in that single motion, quiet as it was, the balance of the entire street tilted in a way no one could explain, but everyone could feel. The boarding house door moved slightly as the wind slipped through the narrow street, a dry whisper against old wood, and she stepped inside without looking back, though she knew the weight of that town had not let go of her. Not yet. Not even a little. The room was dim, lit only by a single oil lamp resting on a crooked table, its flame steady but low, casting long shadows that stretched across the floorboards like quiet warnings. And for a moment she stood there, listening, not to the silence itself, but to what lived beneath it, the distant shuffle of boots outside, the faint murmur of voices that thought walls could keep secrets from traveling. She reached up slowly and touched the turquoise stone at her neck, her fingers resting there as if it carried more than memory, more than meaning, something heavier, something that had followed her farther than the miles behind her, and her breathing steadied in that small gesture, controlled, deliberate, like someone who had learned long ago that fear did not deserve to be seen. Outside, the street had not returned to normal, not fully, because men who had nothing to do found reasons to stay, leaning longer than they needed, talking softer than they should, waiting without admitting they were waiting, and among them stood the same man from before, the one who had shifted his stance just enough to test her path, now lingering near the porch with his arms folded, watching the door she had just closed as if it might open again for him alone. A second man joined him, then a third, their voices low, their laughter thinner than it had been in the daylight, because something about her had unsettled them in ways they could not explain, and when people cannot explain something, they often try to control it instead. Across the street, Caleb Whitmore rose from his seat with no hurry in his movement, no urgency that would draw attention, just a quiet shift from stillness to motion, like a man who had already decided something long before anyone else noticed. There was a choice to be made, and he stepped down from the porch, boots touching the dirt with a soft, measured rhythm that did not match the tension building around him. He did not walk toward the boarding house directly, not at first, instead crossing the street at an angle, passing behind a wagon, letting the shape of it break his outline, because sometimes the smartest way to be seen is not to arrive all at once. Inside, she moved toward the small window, careful not to stand in full view, her eyes scanning the fading light, counting shapes, measuring distance, and she saw them there, just as she expected, not hiding, not bold enough to step forward, caught somewhere in between, and that space between was always the most dangerous, because it waited for someone else to decide what happened next. Her hand lowered from the necklace, and for the first time since she entered the town, her shoulders dropped just a fraction, not from relief, but from readiness, the kind that comes when uncertainty turns into something more defined. The floor creaked once behind her, a sound she had not made, and her head turned sharply, eyes narrowing. But there was nothing there, only the echo of old wood settling into itself, or something pretending to be that, and she did not move closer to check, did not call out, because she understood that some things reveal themselves only when you do not chase them. Outside, the men shifted again, one stepping toward the boarding house steps before stopping, glancing at the others as if waiting for agreement, for permission, for someone to carry the weight of the first move. And in that hesitation, Caleb appeared at the edge of their circle, not facing them directly, not confronting, just standing where he could see both them and the door, his presence quiet but unmistakable, like a line drawn in dust that no one remembered seeing drawn. No words were exchanged, not yet, but the space changed, tightened, and one of the men cleared his throat, forcing a casual tone that did not hold, saying something about the night being long, about checking on a guest, but even he did not believe it fully. Caleb said nothing, did nothing, and that was exactly what made it difficult to ignore him, because there was no challenge to answer, no threat to push back against, only a presence that refused to move aside. Inside, she heard the shift in voices, the subtle change that told her something outside had interrupted the pattern she expected, and she moved closer to the door, not to open it, but to listen, her hand hovering near the handle without touching it, and for a brief second, the entire town seemed to balance on that moment, waiting to see which way it would fall. The silence outside did not break, it stretched, thin and sharp, like something pulled too tight and ready to snap, and the man nearest the steps shifted his weight again, this time slower, more careful, as if the ground itself might remember where he placed his boots. "We are just checking on her," he said, though his voice carried less certainty than before, and no one answered him. Not the men behind him, not the quiet street, and certainly not Caleb Whitmore, who stood with his hands resting easy at his sides, not blocking the path, not stepping forward, just existing in a place that made moving past him feel heavier than it should have. The wind picked up a little, enough to stir dust along the edge of the road, enough to make the lantern above the boarding house door sway slightly, its light shifting across Caleb's face, revealing nothing but calm, the kind of calm that does not come from comfort, but from knowing exactly how far things can go before they cannot go any further. One of the men gave a short laugh, forcing it out like it might bring the moment back under control, and he stepped forward, one foot on the first wooden step, the board creaking under him. But he did not climb higher, because something in the air told him this was as far as he could go without crossing into something else entirely. Caleb's gaze lifted then, not fast, not sharp, just enough to meet the man's eyes. And it was not a challenge, not even a warning. It was simply a presence that did not move, and that was what made it impossible to ignore. Long night ahead, the man muttered, pulling his foot back down, brushing dust from his coat like he had meant to. Stop all along, like the decision had always been his, and the others followed that lead without speaking, stepping back one by one, not retreating, not leaving, just creating space where there had been none before. Inside the boarding house, she felt that shift the way a person feels the change in weather before the clouds move, subtle but undeniable, and her hand lowered from the door handle, her breathing steady, her eyes fixed on the wood in front of her, as if she could see through it without needing to open it. She had expected noise, expected insistence, expected the kind of pressure that does not stop once it begins, but what came instead was hesitation, and hesitation meant something had changed. She turned slightly, moving back into the room, her steps quiet against the floor, and for the first time since entering the town, she allowed herself to sit, not fully, just enough to rest against the edge of the narrow bed, her posture still straight, still ready, but no longer braced for immediate movement. Outside, the men lingered, speaking in lower tones now, their words lost to distance, but their uncertainty clear in the way they shifted, the way they avoided looking directly at Caleb, because acknowledging him would mean acknowledging why they had stopped. Caleb did not stay long, not in the way they expected. He did not claim the space, did not guard the door like a sentry. He simply waited until the moment settled, until the balance tipped back into something that resembled quiet, and then he turned, stepping away from the boarding house with the same measured pace he had used before, leaving behind no command, no instruction. Only the memory of a line that had been drawn without being seen. From the window, she watched him go, just a glimpse through the narrow gap in the curtain, enough to recognize the shape of him, the way he moved, steady, unhurried, like a man who did not need to prove what he had already decided. Her fingers found the turquoise stone again, pressing it lightly, and something in her expression shifted, not softer, not yet, but different. Like a question had replaced an answer she thought she already knew. The street grew quieter. After that, not empty, but restrained, as if the town itself had taken a step back to consider what had just happened. And in that pause, something unseen began to take form, something larger than a single moment, something that would not stay contained within the walls of a boarding house or the silence of one man standing still. Morning did not arrive all at once in that town. It crept in slowly, lights spilling across the horizon in thin lines that stretched over rooftops and drifted down into the street, touching dust first, then wood, then faces that had not fully rested. The boarding house window caught that light in silence, and inside, she was already awake, not because she had slept deeply, but because rest had come in pieces, measured, controlled, the way it does when you are somewhere that has not decided what you are yet. She stood near the window again, not hiding now, just watching, her outline softened by the pale glow of early sun, and the turquoise stone at her neck reflected a faint blue against her skin, subtle, but present, like something that refused to disappear no matter how quiet the room became. Outside, the street carried a different kind of movement, slower, more deliberate, men stepping out onto porches, adjusting hats, glancing once, then twice, toward the boarding house, as if confirming something from the night before had actually happened, as if they needed daylight to believe it. Conversations began again, but they did not rise the same way. They stayed low, careful, like words now carried weight they had not carried yesterday. At the far end of the street, Caleb Whitmore moved through the morning without drawing attention, leading his horse by the reins rather than riding, boots leaving shallow marks in the dust that the wind would erase before noon, his posture unchanged, steady, grounded, like nothing about the night had altered him, and yet everything about the town had shifted around that same stillness. A man near the well nodded to him. not out of friendship, not even respect, but acknowledgement, the kind that comes when something unspoken has been understood, and Caleb returned the nod just as simply, no more, no less. Because out here, too much gesture meant too much meaning. She watched him from the window, just long enough to recognize that he did not look toward her, not even once, and that absence carried more clarity than any direct glance could have offered. It was not indifference, she understood that now. It was choice, and choice meant something different than instinct. Behind her, the boarding house door creaked open, the owner stepping in with a tray of coffee and bread, her eyes lingering for a moment longer than necessary, not unkind, not welcoming, just uncertain, like the rest of the town, and she set the tray down without a word before leaving as quietly as she had entered. The room returned to stillness, broken only by the soft clink of ceramic as she lifted the cup, the warmth grounding her in the present, reminding her that not every moment carried tension, even if the space around it did. Outside, two men from the night before stood near the edge of the street, speaking in low tones, their posture different now, less certain, glancing occasionally toward the ridge beyond the town, as if something out there had begun to occupy their thoughts more than what was inside the boarding house. Because the town had noticed something else in the early light, something that had not been there before, faint tracks in the dirt just beyond the last building, not deep, not recent, but enough to suggest movement, enough to suggest that the story they thought they were watching might not belong to them at all. She stepped away from the window then, finishing the last of the coffee, placing the cup down with quiet precision, and reached for the small satchel resting near the bed, her movements unhurried, deliberate, like someone who had already decided the next step before the sun had risen. When she moved toward the door this time, her hand did not hesitate. It rested on the handle for only a second before turning it, and as the door opened, the morning air carried in the scent of dust, leather, and something else, something distant, something that did not belong to the town, and for a brief moment, the entire street seemed to notice her again, not with the same hunger as before, but with something closer to caution. She stepped out into the light, the turquoise catching the sun once more, and across the street, Caleb paused for the first time, not turning fully, just enough to register that she had stepped back into the world outside that door, and in that small pause, something passed between them, not words, not a promise, just recognition, quiet and steady, the kind that does not ask for anything and yet changes everything that follows. The moment she stepped onto the street, the air shifted again, not as sharp as the night before, but heavier in a different way, like something unseen had moved closer without anyone noticing when it arrived, and the men who had once watched her with restless curiosity now held their gaze just a second shorter than before, not out of respect, not yet, but because something in them had begun to question what they thought they understood. She walked forward with the same steady rhythm, boots pressing into the dry earth, each step measured, each movement controlled. But this time the town did not close in around her the same way. It held back, uncertain, waiting for something else to define the moment. Caleb Whitmore stood near the hitching post, one hand resting lightly on the worn leather of his horse's reins, and though his body remained angled away, his attention was no longer distant. It was aware, quiet, but present in a way that did not intrude. She moved past the boarding house steps, past the general store, the turquoise at her neck catching the rising sun again, and when she reached the center of the street, she slowed, just enough to turn her head slightly toward the ridge beyond the town, where the land stretched wide and empty under the morning light. The tracks that had been whispered about were clearer now, faint impressions in the dust leading away from the town's edge, not scattered, not random, but aligned, purposeful, like a path that had not been meant to be hidden, only not yet noticed. Two men near the well followed her gaze, and for the first time since she arrived, they were not looking at her. They were looking where she was looking, and something in their posture changed, their shoulders tightening, their voices lowering even further as they spoke in fragments that did not need to be completed. She did not linger on them, did not explain, did not offer anything that would ease the uncertainty growing in the air, because some truths were not meant to be given freely. They were meant to be realized slowly, piece by piece, until there was no denying them. Caleb shifted then, just a fraction, enough to step closer to the edge of the street, his boots stopping short of the dust where the tracks began, and though he did not kneel or inspect them, his eyes followed their direction, reading them the way a man reads something familiar without needing to be told what it means. The town watched him as much as they watched her now, not because he demanded it, but because he had become part of whatever was unfolding, whether they understood it or not. She turned back toward the street, her expression unchanged, calm, steady, but there was something beneath it now, something that had settled into place, and when her eyes passed over Caleb for the briefest moment, there was no hesitation, no question, just acknowledgement, clear and quiet, like a door that had been opened without sound. He did not nod, did not move, but the stillness between them held that same understanding, unspoken, unforced. A wagon rolled slowly down the far side of the street, its wheels grinding against the dirt, breaking the silence just enough to remind everyone that life had not stopped. But even that sound felt distant, secondary, like it belonged to another version of the town that no longer fully existed. The men who had lingered the night before began to disperse, not all at once, but in ones and twos, each finding a reason to move away, to return to something ordinary, though nothing felt ordinary anymore, because the question had changed. It was no longer about who she was. It was about what was coming. And as the sun climbed higher, casting longer light across the ridge, the faint line of tracks seemed to lead not away from the town, but toward it, and in that quiet realization, the weight in the air settled deeper, pressing against every thought, every glance, every breath, until even those who had said nothing could feel it clearly now. Something was on its way, and whatever it was, it had already begun to arrive. By midday, the town could no longer pretend the feeling in the air was nothing, because even the simplest sounds carried differently. The creak of a sign, the slow drag of boots, the distant call of someone across the street, all of it seemed to pause just a moment longer before settling, as if the land itself was listening. The tracks at the edge of town had drawn more eyes now, not openly, not with men kneeling in the dust to study them, but with glances that lingered too long, with conversations that circled around them without ever naming them directly. She stood near the far end of the street, where the buildings thinned and the open land began, her posture unchanged, calm and steady. But there was purpose in where she had chosen to stop, a quiet alignment between her presence and the direction of those faint marks in the earth. The turquoise at her neck caught the sun again, brighter now under the noon light, and for a moment it seemed like the only thing in motion, a flicker of color against stillness. A man from the general store approached halfway before stopping, his hat shifting in his hands as if he had intended to speak, to ask something, but the words never found their way out, and he turned back without explanation, leaving the question behind him like dust that never settled. Across the street, Caleb Whitmore moved slower than before, not because he hesitated, but because he no longer needed to hurry through anything. His steps measured, his attention divided between the town and the land beyond it, as if he understood that what mattered was not only here, but what was approaching. He did not go to her, did not close the distance, but he placed himself where he could see her clearly without being seen as following, a balance he maintained without effort. A wagon passed between them briefly, its wooden wheels grinding against the road, and when it cleared, she had taken a single step forward, closer to the boundary where the town ended, and the land began to speak in its own quiet way. The wind shifted again, carrying something new this time. Not strong, not obvious, but enough to change the scent of the air, a trace of leather, of dust that had not settled yet, of movement that had not arrived but was no longer far. The men near the well noticed it too, their conversation fading mid-sentence, their eyes drifting toward the ridge without meaning to, as if drawn by something they could not name but could no longer ignore. She did not turn this time, did not check behind her, because she did not need to. Her awareness was already ahead, already aligned with whatever approached, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low, steady, carried just enough to reach the space around her without demanding attention. They are closer than you think. The words were simple, but they settled heavily, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a statement that did not ask for belief. A few men exchanged looks, uncertain, unsure whether to question her or dismiss what they did not understand. But no one stepped forward, no one challenged it, because something in the way she stood made it clear that she was not offering something to be debated. Caleb heard it from where he stood, the distance between them no longer important, and though he did not respond, his gaze lifted toward the ridge for a brief moment, reading the horizon the way he had read the tracks, quietly, without needing confirmation. The town held its breath again, not in fear, not yet, but in anticipation, the kind that settles deep and refuses to leave once it has taken hold. A bird crossed the sky above, its shadow passing over the ground in a single smooth line, and for a second, every eye followed it without thinking, as if movement itself had become something to track, something to measure against what had not yet arrived. She remained still after speaking, her hands resting at her sides, her shoulders relaxed, as if the weight of what was coming did not belong to her alone. And in that stillness, the truth began to form more clearly, not in words, not in explanations, but in the quiet understanding that whatever approached this town was not something she had brought with her. It was something that had been following a path long before she stepped into the street, and now that path had reached its final stretch. The afternoon stretched long and thin, the kind of heat that pressed down without mercy, flattening sound, slowing movement, forcing everything into a quieter rhythm. And yet beneath that stillness, something continued to build, something that refused to settle no matter how much the town tried to carry on, as if nothing had changed. The ridge beyond the last building shimmered in the distance, light bending slightly above the earth. But now there was something else there too, something that did not belong to heat or wind, a faint disturbance along the horizon that the eye caught before the mind understood. She remained where she had stopped, just at the edge where dust gave way to open land, her figure steady against the brightness, the turquoise at her neck no longer just a reflection of light, but a fixed point in a space that seemed to shift around it. No one approached her now, not even halfway, because the distance between her and the town had taken on a different meaning, no longer physical, but defined by something that had not yet arrived. Caleb Whitmore stood a few yards behind, not close enough to stand beside her, not far enough to be separate, his position deliberate in its quiet balance, and though he did not speak, did not ask questions, his attention remained forward, fixed on the same line she had already read. A low murmur moved through the town again, softer than before, more contained, like people speaking through closed doors even when they stood outside, and one of the older men near the well finally said it out loud, not loudly, but clearly enough to carry. "You see that?" And though no one answered, more eyes turned toward the ridge, more heads tilted slightly, trying to make sense of what was beginning to take shape. It started as a line, barely there, a thin break in the stillness of the horizon, and then it deepened, darkened, resolving slowly into movement, not rushed, not scattered, but steady, measured, like something that did not need to hurry because it knew exactly where it was going. The first horse became visible only after the second glance, then another, then more behind them, shapes forming one by one as the light shifted just enough to reveal what had been there all along. No one spoke now, not even in whispers, because words would have made it too real too quickly, and there was a part of the town that was not ready for that yet. She did not move, did not step forward or back, her gaze steady, her breathing even, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment, not with fear, not with urgency, but with certainty. Caleb's hand rested loosely near his belt, not reaching, not preparing, simply there, the way a man places his hand when he knows action is not the first answer. The riders continued their approach, closing the distance at a pace that made time feel stretched, each second carrying more weight than the last. And as they drew nearer, details began to emerge, the shape of their posture, the way they sat their horses, upright, composed, not like men arriving to challenge, but like men who had already made a decision before they were seen. The town felt smaller now, not because anything had changed in its size, but because something larger had entered its horizon, something that did not belong to it. And for the first time since she arrived, the question shifted completely, away from her, away from who she was or why she had come, and toward what stood beyond the ridge, moving closer with every breath. A child near the far porch stepped forward slightly, only to be pulled back gently by a parent who did not take their eyes off the riders, and even that small movement felt loud in the silence that had settled over everything. The lead rider slowed first, not stopping, just easing the pace as the line behind followed in perfect rhythm, and the dust beneath their horses' hooves lifted in soft clouds that caught the afternoon light, turning the air itself into something visible. She took one step forward then, not toward the town, not toward the riders, but into the space between them, a place that belonged to neither side, and yet held both. And in that single step, the entire moment shifted from anticipation into arrival, because whatever had been building since she first walked into that street had finally reached the point where it could no longer remain unseen, and the town, whether it was ready or not, was now part of it. The riders did not rush the final stretch, and that was what unsettled the town the most, because there was no urgency in their movement, no sign of hesitation either, only a steady advance that carried its own kind of certainty, the kind that does not ask for permission and does not need to explain itself once it arrives. The lead horse came to a gradual stop about 30 yards from where she stood, its breath visible in the warm air as it settled, muscles still but ready, and behind it, the others slowed in perfect sequence, forming a quiet line that stretched across the edge of the land like a boundary that had always been there, but had only just become visible. She did not step back, did not turn, her posture unchanged, her gaze lifting slightly to meet the man at the front, and for a moment, nothing happened, not a word, not a gesture, just a shared stillness that seemed to hold more meaning than anything spoken could carry. The town watched from behind her, from porches, from doorways, from the shadowed edges of buildings where men who had once filled the space with noise now stood without it, their presence smaller somehow, as if the land itself had reminded them where they stood in relation to everything beyond it. Caleb Whitmore remained where he had paused, not crossing into the space between her and the riders, not retreating into the safety of distance, but holding that same quiet balance he had carried from the beginning, his eyes forward, his expression unreadable, as if he understood that this moment did not belong to him, but he would not step away from it either. The lead rider dismounted then, not quickly, not with display, but with a calm precision that spoke of habit, of intention carried out without excess, boots touching the ground with a soft impact that seemed louder than it should have been in the silence. He stepped forward alone, leaving the others where they stood, and though his presence carried weight, it was not forceful, it did not press against the town, it simply existed in it, like something returning rather than arriving. She inclined her head slightly, not in submission, not in greeting, but in recognition, and when she spoke, it was in a language the town did not understand, her voice steady, measured, each word placed carefully, as if it carried history rather than urgency. The man answered in the same tongue, his tone just as calm, and though the words were lost to those watching, the exchange itself was clear enough. This was not confrontation, not negotiation, but confirmation, something already decided being acknowledged in the open. A faint shift moved through the riders behind him, subtle, almost imperceptible, a shared awareness passing between them like a breath, and then one by one, they lowered their gaze, not to the ground entirely, but just enough to signal something that the town had not expected, something that did not match the stories they had told themselves about what this moment would be. The man stepped closer to her, stopping at a respectful distance, and from where he stood, he removed something small from his coat, holding it in his palm for a second before extending it forward, not offering it to the town, not displaying it for effect, but returning it to her. She reached out without hesitation, her fingers closing around the object, and for the first time since she had entered the town, there was a visible shift in her expression, not soft, not relieved, but grounded, as if something that had been carried quietly for a long time had finally found its place again. Behind her, the town remained still, watching a moment they did not understand, feeling its weight without knowing its meaning, and in that not knowing, something inside them began to change, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. Caleb's gaze lowered for a brief second, not away from her, but toward the space between them, where the dust had settled into a pattern that no longer looked like separate paths, but like something that had always been leading here. No one spoke from the town, no one stepped forward, because the moment had made it clear that this was never theirs to control, never theirs to shape, and as the man inclined his head once more before stepping back, returning to his horse with the same calm precision, the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, It was resolved, and in that resolution, the town felt something unfamiliar settle into place. Not fear, not relief, but understanding beginning to take form in the only way it ever truly does, without words, without force, just through what had been seen and could not be unseen. The dust settled slowly after the rider stepped back, not in a rush, not in a way that marked an ending, but like something finding its place again after being disturbed. And for a moment, the entire town remained caught in that quiet, unsure whether to move or remain still, as if any motion might break something that had only just begun to form. She stood where she was, the small object now resting in her hand, her fingers closing around it with a familiarity that did not need to be explained, and though no one in the town knew what it was, they could see what it meant, not in detail, but in weight, in the way her shoulders eased just slightly, in the way her breathing settled into something deeper, more grounded. The riders behind the man remained mounted, their posture unchanged, their presence steady but no longer imposing, as if their purpose had already been fulfilled the moment that exchange was completed. The lead rider placed one hand on the saddle and paused for a brief second before mounting again, his movement unhurried, deliberate, and when he settled into place, he did not look back at the town, not once, because whatever had needed to be seen had already been seen. She turned then, not toward the riders, but toward the street behind her, toward the town that had watched her arrive, watched her stand alone, and now watched her in a different way, not with curiosity, not with that restless edge from before, but with something quieter, something that did not yet have a name but no longer carried the same intent. Her eyes moved across them slowly, not searching, not judging, simply acknowledging, and in that brief sweep, more than one man lowered his gaze, not out of fear, but because something inside him recognized that. He had misunderstood something important. Caleb Whitmore remained where he had been, his stance unchanged, but when her eyes reached him, there was a pause, small but real, and in that pause, the space between them felt different, no longer defined by distance or circumstance, but by something shared, something that had taken shape without either of them asking for it. He gave a slight nod, nothing more than a shift of his chin, and it was not a question, not a claim, just recognition returned in the same quiet way it had been offered. She inclined her head just as slightly, the motion almost invisible unless you were looking for it. And then she stepped forward, closing the space between her and the town by a few feet, not as someone entering, but as someone choosing to remain. Behind her, the riders began to turn, one by one, their horses shifting direction in a smooth, practiced motion, no urgency, no signal given, just a collective understanding that their presence was no longer needed. The sound of hooves against the dry earth rose gently, then faded as they moved away from the edge of the town, the line breaking into distance once more, until the horizon began to take them back, piece by piece, as if they had never fully left it. The town watched them go in silence, not daring to interrupt the moment, not needing to, because what mattered had already happened, and no amount of words would have made it clearer. A man near the well exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but it carried through the stillness like a release of something held too long, and others followed without realizing it, shoulders lowering, tension easing, not completely, but enough to change the way they stood. She remained near the edge of the street, the object still in her hand, the turquoise at her neck catching the last of the afternoon light, and for the first time since she had arrived, she did not feel separate from the place behind her. Caleb stepped forward then, not quickly, not hesitantly, just enough to stand a few paces closer than before, still leaving space, still respecting the line that had been there from the beginning, but no longer needing to stay on the other side of it. He did not speak, and neither did she, because whatever needed to be said had already been carried in the quiet between them, in the way he had stood when others moved, in the way she had not stepped back when everything suggested she should have. The sun dipped lower, stretching shadows across the street once more, and as the light began to fade, the town found itself changed in a way that could not be undone, not because of what had been said, but because of what had been seen, and in that seeing, something had shifted that no one would fully understand until much later, when they realized that the difference between watching and understanding had finally become clear. Evening settled over the town with a different kind of quiet, Not the uneasy silence from before, but something steadier, something that felt like the land itself had exhaled after holding its breath too long, and the shadows stretched longer across the street, softening the edges of everything they touched, turning hard lines into something less certain, less rigid. She remained near the edge of the road for a while longer, the small object still resting in her palm, her thumb brushing over it once, slowly, as if confirming that it was real, that it had truly been returned, and when she finally closed her hand around it, the motion was deliberate, final, like a chapter that had reached its end without needing to announce it. The town moved again, cautiously at first, then with more confidence, doors opening, voices returning in low tones, not as loud as before, not as careless, but present, alive, reshaped by what they had witnessed. A man from the general store stepped out with a broom, sweeping dust from the wooden planks even though the wind would bring it back before nightfall. And the simple act felt different now, grounded, like an attempt to return to something familiar while knowing it would never be exactly the same. Caleb Whitmore stood a few steps away from her now, close enough that the distance no longer carried meaning, yet still leaving space, still holding that quiet respect that had never once faltered. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, the kind that did not fill silence, but moved through it. "You staying?" he asked, not as a demand, not even as an expectation, just a question placed carefully between them. She looked at him then, fully this time, her eyes meeting his without hesitation, without guarded distance. And there was something different in that gaze now, something settled, something that no longer carried the same weight it had when she first walked into the town. "For a while," she answered, her voice just as calm, just as measured, but softer at the edges, like a decision made without conflict. He gave a slight nod, not pressing further, not asking why, because the answer did not belong in words, it belonged in everything that had already happened. The sun dipped lower, the light turning warmer, casting a golden hue across the buildings, across the street, across the space between them, and for a moment, the town looked almost peaceful, almost untouched by the tension that had defined it just hours before. A child stepped out onto a porch nearby, watching them with open curiosity, not the guarded interest of the adults, but something simpler, something that had not yet learned to divide the world into sides, and she noticed it, her gaze softening just slightly as she offered the smallest nod, a gesture so brief it could have been missed, but it was enough. The child smiled, then disappeared back inside, and that small exchange carried more meaning than the town could fully understand. Caleb shifted his weight, glancing briefly toward the ridge where the riders had vanished, then back to her, and though he did not say it, there was a quiet understanding in his expression that whatever had brought her here had not been random, and whatever came next would not be either. She turned slightly, looking down the street, taking in the buildings, the people, the place that had watched her so closely, and there was no tension in her posture now, no readiness for confrontation, only presence, grounded and certain. The turquoise at her neck caught the last light of the day once more, a steady glow that did not fade even as the sun dipped below the horizon, and in that fading light, the town seemed to settle into a new shape, one that made room for something it had not understood before. Caleb stepped back half a pace then, not retreating, but giving her the space to move if she chose, and she did, taking a slow step forward into the street, not as someone passing through, but as someone who had decided to remain, at least for now. The wind carried through the town again, gentle this time, lifting dust in soft patterns that no longer felt restless, and as the first lanterns were lit along the street, their glow steady and warm, the quiet that followed was no longer uncertain, it was complete, holding within it everything that had changed without needing to say a single word. The night did not fall heavy on the town anymore. It settled gently, like something that had finally found where it belonged, and the lanterns along the street burned steady without flicker, their light stretching across the wooden planks and dust in soft amber lines that no longer felt tense or uncertain. She stood near the center of the street now, no longer at the edge, no longer between two worlds, but within the space itself, her presence no longer drawing that same restless attention, but something quieter, something steadier, like a point the town had begun to accept rather than question. The small object in her hand had been tucked away, hidden once more, not out of fear, but because it no longer needed to be seen to carry its meaning, and the turquoise at her neck remained the only visible trace of where she came from, catching the lantern light in brief flashes as she moved. People passed her now without stopping, some offering brief nods, others simply continuing on, their eyes no longer lingering, no longer searching for something to define her by, because that need had faded with the day. A woman from the boarding house stepped outside with a folded blanket, pausing for a moment before handing it to her without a word, the gesture simple, practical, but clear in its intent, and she accepted it with a slight nod. No hesitation, no distance, just acknowledgement. Across the street, Caleb Whitmore leaned lightly against the post outside the saloon, his hat tipped back just enough to see. Clearly now, not hiding his gaze, but not placing it where it did not belong either. And when their eyes met again, it was no longer brief, no longer cautious. It held for a moment, steady and quiet, like two people who had already said what needed to be said without speaking. The sounds of the town continued around them, boots against wood, a door closing somewhere down the street, the low murmur of voices that no longer dropped when she passed. And in those sounds, there was a rhythm returning, not the same as before, but something new, something that carried awareness with it. A man who had stood among the group the night before crossed the street slowly, stopping a few feet away, his hands resting awkwardly at his sides, as if unsure what to do with them. And for a moment, he simply stood there, searching for words that did not come easily. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice rough, not from age, but from unfamiliar use of something honest, and he paused again before continuing, "We misread things yesterday." The words were simple, but they carried weight, not as an apology fully formed, but as the beginning of one, and she looked at him calmly, not softening, not hardening, just seeing him as he stood, and after a second, she gave a small nod, not accepting or rejecting, just acknowledging what had been said. That was enough. The man stepped back, not relieved, not burdened, just quieter than before, and he returned to his place without another word. Caleb watched the exchange without interruption, his expression unchanged, but something in his posture eased, a tension that had never fully shown now settling into something more grounded. The wind moved through the street again, lifting the edge of the blanket she held, carrying the scent of dust and wood and distant land, and this time, it did not bring unease with it. It simply passed through, as it always had, unnoticed until now. She turned slightly, looking down the street once more, and then back toward the ridge, where darkness had taken the horizon completely, hiding what had been there earlier, but not erasing its presence, because some things, once seen, remain even when they are no longer visible. Caleb stepped away from the post then, closing the distance by a single step, not enough to stand beside her, but enough to stand closer than before, and he spoke again, his voice low, measured. "Town changes slow." He let the words settle, not offering more, because more was not needed. She looked at him, the faintest hint of something softer passing through her expression, and replied just as quietly, "So do people." The two stood there for a moment longer, the lantern light steady between them, the town moving around them without disruption, and in that stillness, something settled that did not need to be named, something that had grown from silence, from restraint, from the simple act of standing where others had stepped away. The night deepened, the stars beginning to show above the rooftops, and the town, for the first time since she arrived, felt like a place that could hold more than it had before, not because it had changed completely, but because it had begun to understand that it could. The night deepened slowly, not with the weight it once carried, but with a quiet clarity that settled over the town like a long-awaited truth finally spoken without words, and the lanterns burned lower now, their glow softer, their light no longer fighting the dark but existing within it, steady and certain. She remained in the street a while longer, the blanket resting over her shoulders, the fabric catching the breeze in small movements that mirrored the calm she carried. And though the town moved around her, there was no longer a distance between her and the people who passed, only space, natural and unforced. The stars above had begun to fill the sky, one by one, each point of light sharp against the vastness. And for a moment, she looked up, her gaze lingering there, as if measuring something far beyond the town itself, something that stretched past the ridge, past the paths that had led her here. Caleb Whitmore stood beside her now, not watching her, not guarding, just present in a way that did not demand attention. And when he shifted his stance slightly, it was not out of restlessness, but from the simple need to remain grounded in the moment. A breeze carried through again, cooler this time, brushing past the buildings, lifting dust that no longer felt unsettled, and somewhere down the street, a door closed gently, the sound final but not harsh. She lowered her gaze from the sky and looked down the road. The same road she had walked when she first entered, the same path that had held every eye, every question, every silent judgment. And now it lay before her unchanged in form, but altered in meaning. No longer a place of separation, but one that connected what had once seemed distant. A man passed carrying a lantern, its light swinging slightly with his steps, and when he crossed near her, he paused just long enough to tip his hat, not out of obligation, but out of something quieter, something learned in the hours that had come before, and she acknowledged it with a small nod, the gesture simple, but complete. The town had not become something entirely different. It had not shed everything it once was, but it had shifted just enough to allow something new to exist within it, something that would not disappear when morning came. Caleb glanced toward the horizon once more, though it was now swallowed in darkness, and then back toward the street. And though he said nothing, there was a question there, not in words, but in the way he remained where he was, in the way he had not stepped away even when the moment no longer required it. She felt it, not as pressure, not as expectation, but as presence, and she turned slightly toward him, her expression calm, steady, the same as it had been, but carrying something more now, something that did not need to be guarded. "You did not ask who I was," she said quietly, her voice blending into the night without breaking it. He did not answer immediately, his gaze resting somewhere just past her, as if the answer did not need to be shaped too quickly, and when he finally spoke, his tone remained even, grounded. Did not seem like it mattered. The words settled between them, simple, but carrying a truth that the town itself had begun to understand without saying it aloud. She held his gaze for a moment longer, and there was a faint shift in her expression then, not a smile, not quite, but something close to it, something that spoke of recognition rather than relief. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying with it the scent of the open land, of distance, of paths that still stretched beyond what could be seen, and she turned her attention back to the road, her stance relaxed, no longer poised to leave, but no longer bound to stay either. The night wrapped around the town fully now, the last traces of light fading into a sky filled with stars, and in that quiet, steady darkness, the change that had begun did not announce itself, did not demand to be understood, it simply remained, present in every glance that no longer lingered too long, in every step that did not hesitate without reason, in every moment where silence held meaning without needing to explain it. Caleb remained where he was, and so did she, not because they had chosen anything beyond the moment, but because the moment itself had become enough, and as the town settled into the rhythm of night, the story that had unfolded did not close. It widened, leaving behind a space where something new could continue, quietly, steadily, without needing to be named. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, the town had already begun to change in ways no one would speak about out loud, but everyone would remember in quiet moments long after the dust settled. The sky shifted from deep black to a faint blue-gray, stretching across the open land like a promise that did not need to be made twice, and the street below lay still, untouched for a brief moment before footsteps and voices would return. She stood at the edge of the porch now, the same boarding house that had once felt like a boundary, now simply a place. Her posture relaxed, her gaze steady as she watched the light rise over the ridge where the riders had disappeared the night before. The turquoise at her neck caught that first pale glow again, softer this time, less like a signal and more like a quiet reminder of something that did not need to be proven anymore. Caleb Whitmore stepped out from the saloon just as the light reached the wooden planks, his hat in his hand, his movements unhurried, and he paused when he saw her, not in surprise, but in recognition of a moment that felt complete without needing to be spoken. The town had not woken yet, not fully, but there were signs of it stirring, a door opening slowly, the faint sound of water being poured somewhere inside, the low creak of a wagon wheel turning in place before the day began. She turned slightly toward him, not with the guarded distance she had carried before, but with something more open, something that did not ask for permission to exist. "It looks different," she said quietly, her voice blending with the early morning air, and he followed her gaze down the street, taking in the same buildings, the same road, the same horizon, and yet understanding exactly what she meant. "It is the same," he replied after a moment, his tone steady, "but not in the way it used to be." The words settled between them like something simple and true, and she gave a faint nod, the kind that comes when something does not need to be explained any further. A man stepped out from the general store then, broom in hand again, pausing when he saw them, and this time, there was no hesitation in his movement, no uncertainty in his expression, only a brief nod before he began sweeping the dust from the boards, the sound steady, rhythmic, like a town learning how to move forward one small action at a time. Others followed, stepping into the light, carrying out their routines, but something had shifted in the way they looked at the space around them, in the way they moved past one another, in the way they allowed silence to exist without filling it with assumptions. She stepped down from the porch, her boots meeting the ground with a soft, grounded sound, and for a moment, she stood there again in the street, not as someone passing through, not as someone standing apart, but as someone who had become part of the place without needing to change who she was. Caleb watched her, not closely, not carefully, just present, and when she began to walk, he did not follow immediately. He gave her space, the same space he had given from the beginning, because some things are not meant to be rushed, not meant to be claimed, only understood. She paused after a few steps, turning just enough to glance back, and there was a quiet invitation in that movement, not spoken, not insisted, but clear in its simplicity, and he stepped forward then, closing the distance by a single pace, enough to walk beside her without crossing the line that had always been respected. They moved down the street together, not speaking, not needing to, the sound of their footsteps blending into the rhythm of the town as it came to life around them. The ridge in the distance remained unchanged, the horizon still wide and open, but what it held no longer felt distant or unknown. It felt connected, part of the same world that now stretched through the town itself. And in that quiet morning light, as the day began without urgency, without tension, there was something left behind in the space between what had been and what now was, something that could not be taken back, something that did not need to be named, only carried forward in the way people chose to see each other from that moment on. Out here, change did not come with noise or force. It came like this, slow, steady, and once it settled in, it stayed, not because it had to, but because it finally belonged.